Lillian's world was nothing but the sound of her own heart hitting her ribs like a trapped bird. The rain in Seoul was cold and sharp, soaking through her denim jacket until it felt like lead on her shoulders. Every time she turned a corner, she hoped to see her brother's face, but all she saw were flickering neon signs and dark, empty puddles. Behind her, the shadow never stopped moving. Victor was a man in a dark hooded jacket, always 10 steps behind, never losing his grip on the chase. Lillian gripped the straps of her pink backpack so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She was frightened and alert, her eyes darting for any way to escape. She knew she couldn't let him catch her, not with what was hidden inside her bag. The alley was a dead end. Lillian skidded to a stop, her boots splashing into a deep, oily puddle. She turned around, her chest heaving, her curly hair falling out of its 2 space buns as she realized there was nowhere left to run. Victor stepped into the dim light of the alley. His face was partially hidden by his hood, giving him a suspicious and threatening appearance. He didn't say a word, he just reached out a hand, his fingers twitching as he moved toward the small girl huddled against the wet brick. Lillian backed up until her spine hit the cold graffiti wall. She looked tiny against the towering buildings, a young girl with deep brown skin and a heart full of terror. Thump. The sound was heavy and deliberate. It wasn't the sound of a footstep. It was the sound of a polished cane hitting the pavement. Victor froze. His hands stayed in midair, but his eyes went wide with a sudden, sharp terror. The air in the alleyway suddenly felt heavy, like the moments before a massive thunderstorm breaks. Out of the shadows stepped a man who looked like he owned the rain itself. He was a stern, middle-aged Korean man in a black suit and a dark coat. He stood with a serious and intimidating expression, appearing both protective and powerful. This was King. He didn't look like a hero from a storybook. He looked like a man who built an empire on silence and controlled violence. He stepped between the small girl and the man in the hood, his shadow stretching long and dark across the concrete. "You're in the wrong alley," King said. His voice was low, coming out like ice and gravel. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence alone stopped the world cold. Victor looked at King and then at the girl, and his hands began to shake. He realized he hadn't cornered a lonely child. He had accidentally trespassed into the territory of the city's most feared boss. King looked down at Lillian, his eyes measuring everything about the girl who refused to cry. Something about her fierce stare reminded him of a life he had almost forgotten. Victor's breath came out in a ragged cloud. He looked at the heavy cane in King's hand, then at the sharp, dark eyes of the man wearing the black suit. Victor knew the stories. People who caused trouble in King's district didn't just get a warning, they disappeared. Slowly, Victor began to back away, his hands raised in a fake gesture of peace. When he reached the mouth of the alley, he turned and sprinted, his dark hooded jacket blending into the rainy night until he was gone. King didn't chase him. A lion didn't chase a rat that had already run. Instead, he turned his attention to the small girl standing against the graffiti-covered wall. Most children her age would be screaming or reaching for a hand to hold. But Lillian didn't move. She stood her ground, her deep brown skin glistening with rain and her curly hair held up in 2 space buns. She looked up at him with eyes that were frightened but incredibly alert, her knuckles white from gripping the straps of her pink backpack. King looked at her with a serious, intimidating expression. He didn't feel pity. Pity was for the weak, and King had spent 15 years building a syndicate on silence and controlled violence. What he felt was something closer to curiosity. He wondered why a 6-year-old girl was wandering his streets alone, and why a man like Victor was so desperate to catch her. "Why didn't you run?" King asked. His voice was like ice and gravel, the same tone he used when speaking to his most dangerous enemies. Lillian took a shaky breath, but she didn't look away. "I was waiting," she whispered. "For what?" "For you to move so I could find a better way out," she said. It was a street-smart answer that made King's jaw tighten. He had met many brave men, but nobody had ever made him feel both small and enormous at the same time like this child. He looked at the pink backpack she held like a shield. He could see the outline of something hard and rectangular inside it. "Where is your mother?" he asked. "She's gone," Lillian replied simply. She said it without self-pity as a fact of her life. King stayed silent for a moment. He thought about his own life, how he had learned the loneliness of the world early just like her. Something moved through his chest like a tremor through stone. He wasn't a hero and he didn't do favors, but he knew that if he left her here, Victor or someone worse would be back within the hour. "Get in the car," King commanded. He didn't ask, he was a man used to giving orders. Lillian studied him for a second, her eyes measuring him to see if he was their father or a new threat. She was deciding if she could believe him. Finally, she took a step forward, still gripping her bag. King didn't offer to carry it. He knew she wouldn't let go of it anyway. The black car glided through the city like a silent ghost, the tires humming against the wet pavement. Inside, the air was thick with a heavy, cold quiet. Lillian sat as far away from King as possible, her small frame pressed against the door. She watched the neon lights of Seoul blur into streaks of blue and red through the tinted glass. She didn't ask where they were going. In her world, asking questions usually led to trouble. Instead, she just tightened her grip on her pink backpack, feeling the hard edges of the drive hidden inside. They eventually pulled up to a set of massive iron gates that looked like they belonged to a castle. Beyond the gates stood a house made of gray stone and glass, surrounded by high walls and men in dark suits who didn't smile. It was a fortress. To anyone else, it looked like a palace of wealth, but to Lillian, it looked like a gilded cage. King stepped out of the car, his long coat snapping in the wind. He didn't wait for her. He simply expected her to follow. Lillian climbed out, her boots clicking on the polished driveway. She looked up at the towering house and then at the guards. None of them looked at her directly, but she could feel their eyes tracking her every move. Inside, the house was even colder than the rain outside. The floors were made of white marble that shone like ice, and the ceilings were so high they made Lillian feel even smaller than she already was. King led her into a large dining room where a long wooden table sat under a glimmering chandelier. "Sit," King said, gesturing to a chair that looked too heavy for her to even move. Lillian sat, but she didn't let go of her backpack. She placed it on her lap and hugged it to her chest. A woman in a neat uniform appeared and placed a bowl of steaming white rice and a plate of grilled fish in front of her. The smell was delicious, enough to make anyone's stomach growl, but Lillian didn't move a muscle. King sat at the head of the table. He didn't eat. He just watched her with those dark, unreadable eyes. He was waiting for her to break, to cry, or to start asking for help. But Lillian simply stared back. She didn't touch the silver chopsticks. She didn't take a single bite of the food. The silence between them grew longer and heavier. It wasn't an awkward silence, it was a battle. King used silence as a weapon to make people nervous, to make them confess their secrets. But Lillian used silence as a wall. As long as she didn't speak, she was safe. As long as she didn't eat his food, she didn't owe him anything. King leaned back, his fingers tapping slowly on the arm of his chair. He saw the way she watched the door, the way her eyes darted to the shadows in the corners of the room. She was like a wild animal that had been cornered but refused to surrender. For the first time in years, King felt a flicker of respect. He had spent his whole life surrounding himself with people who talked too much because they were afraid. This little girl, with her space buns and her dirty denim jacket, was the only person who could match his stillness. "You'll have to eat eventually," King said, his voice echoing in the empty room. Lillian didn't blink. She just pulled her backpack a little bit tighter. They sat there in the dim light of the fortress, two strangers made of stone, each waiting for the other to move first. The hours passed and the silence in the room grew heavy like a thick blanket. Lillian's small shoulders began to slump. She tried to keep her eyes wide, but the warmth of the room and the exhaustion of being hunted finally won. Her head bobbed once, twice, and then her chin rested against her chest. Her grip on the pink backpack loosened, and it slid from her lap onto the white marble floor with a soft thud. King stood up. He didn't make a sound as he walked toward her. He looked down at the sleeping girl. In the dim light, she didn't look like a street-smart survivor anymore. She just looked like a tired child who needed a bed. He reached down and picked up the pink backpack. It was decorated with glittery patches and felt light, except for the heavy weight at the bottom. He reached inside. His large hand pulled out a small metallic rectangle. It was a high-tech encrypted drive, the kind used by the highest levels of the criminal underworld to hide secrets that could start or end wars. There was a small symbol etched into the side, a golden fong. King's eyes narrowed. He knew that symbol. It belonged to his most violent rivals, the same people Victor worked for. King walked over to his desk and plugged the drive into a sleek black laptop. Rows of red code began to scroll across the screen. This wasn't just data, it was a map of every secret shipment and hidden warehouse in the city. This was the kind of treasure that men would burn a city down to find. Lillian must have picked it up when she was separated from her brother, unaware that she was carrying the most dangerous object in Seoul. He looked back at Lillian. She was still fast asleep, her breathing deep and rhythmic. He finally understood why Victor had been chasing her with such desperation. Lillian hadn't just been a girl in an alley, she was a walking target. To the rats of Seoul, she wasn't a person, she was a prize. They wouldn't stop until they got the drive back, and they wouldn't care what happened to the girl who held it. King realized that by bringing her here, he had brought a war into his own house. If word got out that he had the drive, every hitman and syndicate boss in the country would be coming for his gates. He looked at the drive, then at the girl with the space buns. For 15 years, King had only cared about his empire and his power. He had always chosen the logical path, the one that kept his business safe. But as he looked at Lillian, tucked small and vulnerable in the oversized chair, he felt a strange, cold fire in his chest. The logical thing to do was to give the drive back and hand over the girl to keep the peace. But King didn't feel like being logical. He looked at the shadows dancing on the wall and realized that his quiet life was over. He wasn't just going to keep the drive. He was going to make sure that anyone who tried to touch this girl regretted the day they were born. The morning sun moved through the tall windows of the estate, but it didn't make the house feel any warmer. King walked down the long, silent hallway, his cane tapping rhythmically against the marble. He was headed toward his office to deal with the encrypted drive, but a small movement in the guest suite made him stop. The door was cracked open just an inch. King stood in the shadows of the hallway, his dark coat blending into the gloom. Inside the room, Lillian stood in front of a massive, gold-framed mirror that reached from the floor to the ceiling. She looked tiny against the expensive wallpaper, a small girl with deep brown skin and her curly hair still tucked into two slightly messy space buns. She didn't know he was there. Lillian was staring intensely at her own reflection. She squared her small shoulders and pulled her denim jacket tight. Then she scowled. She lowered her eyebrows, tightened her jaw, and narrowed her eyes until she looked as mean as the men who had been chasing her. She practiced tilting her head back, trying to look down her nose at an invisible enemy. She was building an armor out of her own face. King felt a sharp, cold pang behind his ribs, the kind of feeling he usually ignored. He watched as she relaxed her face, her bottom lip trembling for just a second, before she forced the tough face back on. She was terrified, but she was refusing to let the world see it. She was learning how to hide her heart before she had even learned how to ride a bike. Suddenly, King wasn't looking at a stranger's child. He was looking at a ghost. He remembered being 7 years old, standing in front of a cracked window in a dirty alley in Mapo. He remembered practicing that same look, trying to make his eyes go cold so the older boys wouldn't see the hunger or the fear. He had spent 15 years perfecting that mask until it became his real face. He had built an empire on that silence, but looking at Lillian he realized for the first time what it had cost him. It cost him the ability to feel anything at all. Lillian reached up and adjusted her backpack straps, her knuckles turning white. She took a deep breath, puffed out her chest, and nodded at her reflection as if to say, "You can do this." King pulled back into the shadows before she could see him. He didn't want to break her concentration. He knew that for a girl like Lillian, that tough face was the only weapon she had. But as he walked away, the sound of his cane felt heavier than before. He had brought her here to protect the drive, but now the drive felt like a small, unimportant thing. He realized that Victor and the other rats weren't just coming for a piece of plastic and code. They were coming for this little girl who was trying so hard to be brave in a world that wanted to break her. For the first time in his life, King didn't care about the business deal or the syndicate piece. He looked at his own reflection in the glass of a passing picture frame and saw a man who was finally ready to burn everything down to keep that one small light from going out. The office was silent, but it was the kind of silence that felt like a stretched rubber band ready to snap. King sat behind his heavy oak desk, his face as still as a statue. Across from him stood his 3 top lieutenants. These were men who had helped him build his empire, men who understood that in their world, feelings were more dangerous than bullets. "Sir, we need to be realistic," the oldest lieutenant, Han, said. He adjusted his glasses, his voice calm but firm. "The girl is a problem. She is more than a problem, she is a target. Victor's people have already contacted our borders. They know she is here." King didn't move. He kept his eyes on the encrypted drive sitting on his desk. And they aren't just asking for the drive anymore," Han continued, stepping forward. "They want the girl. They say she saw too much. To them she is a witness. Keeping her here isn't just a risk, it's an invitation for a war we don't need. She is inconvenient and complicated." The second lieutenant, a younger man with a scar across his brow, nodded in agreement. "The peace treaty with the southern districts is almost finished, King. If we hand her over, the deal is done. We get the territory, they get their rat, and everything goes back to normal. Why risk $50 million and the lives of our men for a child who isn't even one of ours?" King finally looked up. His gaze was so sharp it made the younger man flinch. "One of ours," King repeated quietly. "You know what I mean, sir," Han added quickly, trying to smooth things over. "She is a stranger. She was found in an alley. We have no obligation to her. The Syndicate's board is already asking questions. They think you're losing your edge because you haven't turned her over yet. They see a little girl, we see a liability." The word liability echoed in the room. In the Mafia world, a liability was something you removed. You didn't feed it fish and rice, and you certainly didn't let it stay in your guest suite. "She has the drive," King said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "We have the drive now," Han countered, gesturing to the desk. "We can keep the data and give them the girl. It's the logical choice. It's the choice you would have made a month ago without even thinking about it." King stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. He thought about Lillian in front of the mirror, practicing her tough face, because she had no one else to protect her. He thought about how his own men were talking about her like she was a piece of trash to be traded away. "The choice I would have made a month ago is not the choice I am making today," King said. The air in the room turned freezing. "The girl stays. If Victor wants her, tell him to come through the front gate. But remind him that nobody leaves my house without my permission." The lieutenants looked at each other, their faces filled with worry. They knew that King was choosing a fight over a fortune. As they filed out of the room, Han lingered by the door. "This is going to cost us everything, King," Han whispered. "Then let it," King replied, turning his back to look out the window at the city he ruled, a city that was about to become a battlefield. The sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the marble floors of the estate. King found Lillian sitting on the edge of the large guest bed, her pink backpack resting in her lap like a prize she refused to surrender. She wasn't practicing her tough face anymore. She just looked tired, her small shoulders drooping under the weight of the denim jacket. King stood in the doorway, his silhouette tall and imposing. He didn't come inside right away. He waited, respecting the silent wall she had built around herself. But then, for the first time, Lillian looked up at him and didn't look away. "My brother told me never to trust men in suits," she said. Her voice was small, but it carried through the quiet room like a bell. King leaned slightly on his cane. "Your brother sounds like a wise man. Why did he say that?" Lillian's fingers traced the glittery patch of a rainbow on her bag. "Because men in suits are the ones who took our parents. He said they use fancy words to hide the fact that they are just wolves." She paused, her dark eyes searching King's face. "Are you a wolf?" King felt a strange tightness in his chest. For 15 years he had been the apex predator of Seoul. He was exactly the kind of man her brother had warned her about. "In this city, Lillian, you have to be a wolf to survive. But even wolves protect their own." Lillian looked back down at her bag. "His name is Marcus. He's 12. He told me to run if we ever got separated. He said he'd find me at the park with the blue slide, but I waited all day and he never came. That's when the man in the hood started following me." She opened the small front pocket of the backpack and pulled out a crumpled photograph. It showed a tall, skinny boy with a wide smile, his arm thrown around Lillian's shoulders. They both looked happy, standing in front of a sun-drenched playground. "He's the only one I have left," she whispered. A single tear escaped and ran down her cheek, leaving a dark trail on her deep brown skin. "He didn't mean to lose me. I saw the shiny metal thing on the ground and I thought it was a toy. I ran to pick it up and when I looked back the crowd was too big. I couldn't see his yellow shirt anymore." King walked into the room, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick rug. He sat in a chair across from her, his stern expression softening just a fraction. He thought about the encrypted drive, the shiny metal thing, that had cost her everything. It was a piece of plastic and code that his lieutenants wanted to trade for a peace treaty, but to Lillian, it was the reason she was alone. "I will find him," King said. It wasn't a comfort or a hollow promise. It was a vow. Lillian wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at him. For the first time she didn't see a mafia boss or a giant in a dark coat. She saw a man who was looking at her the way Marcus did, like she mattered. The wall of silence between them didn't just crack, it crumbled. Lillian reached out and placed her small hand near his on the table. She didn't grab it, but she didn't pull away either. In that moment, King realized that his empire didn't matter. The $50 million deal didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the little girl who had finally decided he wasn't a wolf. The rain outside the fortress had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming, masking the sounds of the city. Inside King's private study, the air was cold and still. Han, the first lieutenant, stood by the window watching the digital security monitors. He wasn't looking for intruders, he was looking for an opportunity. 4 years Han had been King's shadow, his second in command, and his most trusted advisor. But Han didn't believe in protecting children or keeping promises. He believed in the business, and King's sudden change of heart was a threat to everything they had built. Han pulled a burner phone from his pocket, the screen glowing brightly in the dim room. His thumbs hovered over the keypad. He knew that by sending this message he was committing the ultimate sin in their world, betrayal. But in his mind he wasn't a traitor. He was a surgeon cutting out a sickness to save the body. King had gone soft, and a soft boss was a dead boss. "The girl is in the north wing, second floor," Han typed, his face as unreadable as the marble floors. "The security rotation changes at midnight. The back gate will be unlocked for 3 minutes. Do not fail." He hit send. The small message delivered, notification flickered on the screen, and for a split second Han felt a chill go down his spine. He was opening the gates of the fortress to the very rats King had sworn to keep out. He was handing Lillian over to Victor, knowing exactly what they would do to her to get that encrypted drive back. He tucked the phone away just as the heavy oak doors creaked open. King walked in, leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes tired but sharp. He looked at Han, the man who had stood by his side through 100 battles. "The perimeter is secure?" King asked, his voice low and raspy. "Everything is under control, sir," Han replied, his voice perfectly steady. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He had practiced his own tough face for decades, and he was a master at the art of the lie. "The men are on high alert. No one is getting into this estate tonight." King nodded, looking out at the dark grounds of the estate. He felt a strange sense of unease, a prickling at the back of his neck that usually warned him of danger. But he looked at Han and dismissed the feeling. He trusted Han like he trusted his own right hand. "Good," King said. "I'm going to check on the girl. She's finally sleeping." As King turned to leave, Han watched him go. He felt a moment of pity for his old friend, but it was quickly replaced by the cold logic of the Syndicate. King was choosing a little girl with space buns and a pink backpack over a multi-million-dollar empire. To Han that wasn't loyalty, it was madness. Outside, in the shadows beyond the iron gates, Victor and a team of hooded men moved silently through the rain. They had received the signal. The inner rat had done his job. The fortress was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap. And as King walked down the hall to stand guard over a sleeping child, he had no idea that the greatest threat wasn't outside the walls. It was already inside, holding the keys to the kingdom. The midnight silence of the estate was shattered by the sharp, high-pitched chirp of a security alarm. King was halfway down the corridor when the lights flickered and died, plunging the fortress into a suffocating darkness. He didn't need the lights to know what was happening. The prickling at the back of his neck had been right. The rats were inside. "Lillian," he whispered, his voice cutting through the dark like a blade. Heavy footsteps thundered at the end of the hallway. Muffled shouts and the metallic clack of weapons echoed through the marble halls. Normally, King would have stood his ground, commanding his men to defend the perimeter and protect his vault. But tonight his empire didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the small room at the end of the north wing where a girl with space buns was sleeping. He moved with a speed that defied his age, his cane striking the floor in a rapid, urgent rhythm. A shadow lunged at him from a side door, one of Victor's men, his face hidden by a dark hood. King didn't hesitate. He swung his heavy cane with a practiced, brutal grace, knocking the man aside before he could even raise his weapon. King wasn't fighting for territory or money anymore, he was fighting against time. As he reached the stairs, he saw Han standing near the balcony, his face illuminated by the red glow of the emergency lights. Their eyes met for a split second. In that look, King saw the truth of the betrayal. He didn't stop to argue or ask why. He simply shoved past, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear Lillian now, a high, terrified scream that made his blood turn to ice. "King, help me." He reached the guest suite just as the door was being kicked inward. Victor was there, his hand reaching for Lillian's denim jacket as she scrambled backward toward the window, clutching her pink backpack to her chest. The room was a mess of shadows and shattered glass. "Get away from her," King growled. He stepped into the room, his silhouette filling the doorway. Victor spun around, a desperate snarl on his face. "Give us the drive, King. It's over. Your own men turned on you." King didn't look at the drive. He didn't look at the window. He looked only at Lillian, whose eyes were wide with a terror no child should ever know. He stepped forward, ignoring the weapons pointed at him. Every step was a choice. Every movement was a declaration that the old king, the man who cared only for power, was dead. "I don't care about the drive," King said, his voice steady even as the world crumbled around him. "But if you touch that girl, you won't leave this house alive." The air in the room was thick with the smell of rain and gunpowder. Victor hesitated, startled by the raw, fierce protectiveness in the older man's eyes. In that moment of hesitation, King lunged forward, placing himself like a human shield between the girl and the wolves. He wasn't a boss defending his throne. He was a guardian protecting his heart. The room was filled with the heavy scent of smoke and rain as King stood his ground. Victor's men hesitated, their guns wavering. They had come for a piece of plastic, but they were facing a man who had finally found something worth more than his throne. King didn't look at the enemies circling him. He looked only at Lillian, who was huddled behind him, her small hand gripping the back of his dark coat. "You want the drive?" King's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the metallic rectangle. The shiny toy that had caused so much pain glinted under the flickering emergency lights. Victor stepped forward, his eyes greedy. "Give it here, King. Do the smart thing. Save your empire." King looked at the drive, then at the pink backpack Lillian held like a shield. He thought about the photograph of her brother, Marcus, and the tough face she practiced in the mirror. He realized that as long as this drive existed, Lillian would never be safe. She would always be a target and he would always be a wolf guarding a prize. Without a word, King pulled a sleek silver lighter from his vest. With a flick of his thumb, a small flame danced in the darkness. He held the encrypted drive over the fire. "What are you doing?" Han shouted from the doorway, his voice cracking with panic. "That's $50 million. That's our future." "No," King said, his eyes locking onto Victor's. "This is your leash. And I'm cutting it." The plastic began to bubble and hiss. The smell of melting electronics filled the air as the drive caught fire. King dropped the burning wreck onto the marble floor and crushed it beneath his heavy leather boot. The secrets, the maps, and the peace treaty were nothing but a pile of melted scrap. The room went deathly silent. Victor looked at the ruined drive, his face turning pale. Without the data, he had nothing to give his bosses. He was a failure, and in his world, failures didn't last long. Sensing the shift in power, King's loyal guards, those who hadn't followed Han, burst into the room surrounding the intruders. Victor and his men backed away, realizing the siege was over. They fled into the rainy night, leaving the fortress behind. King didn't chase them. He turned around and knelt on one knee, something he hadn't done for anyone in 15 years. He was at eye level with Lillian. She was shaking, her space buns messy and her face streaked with tears, but she didn't run. "It's gone, Lillian," King said softly. "No one is coming for the bag anymore." Lillian looked at the melted pile on the floor, then back at King. "Does that mean I can go to the park with the blue slide?" King reached out and for the first time, gently patted her shoulder. "We are going to find Marcus. And until we do, you stay with me." Lillian finally let go of the backpack straps. She took a deep breath and reached out, wrapping her small arms around King's neck in a tight hug. King stiffened for a second, his heart unused to the warmth, before he slowly wrapped his arms around her. He had lost his empire, his peace treaty, and his second in command. He had chosen a life of war to protect a child he barely knew. But as he held her, King realized he hadn't lost anything at all. He had finally found his way home. The lesson: wearing a tough face might help you survive, but letting someone in is what helps you live. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling stories. Thanks.